Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast. Today we are taking a trip back to the 19th century, specifically 1853, to crack open a truly revolutionary text that, well, it radically redefined the relationship between history, geography, and economic theory.
Our mission for this deep dive is to analyze die politische Ökonomie vom Standpunkte der geschichtlichen Method or political economy from the standpoint of the historical method by the German economist Karl Knies. And this isn't just some dry academic critique, it's a foundational document that challenged the very idea of universal economic laws.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you've ever felt that a one-size-fits-all economic policy fails because it ignores the unique culture or history of a place, Knies is basically your intellectual ally.
He really is. We're diving into a period where thinkers, especially the followers of Adam Smith, were trying to establish economics as a science like physics. A set of iron laws true for all time, all people, all nations.
And Mies just steps in and says, not so fast.
Yeah.
For anyone who has ever wondered why the perfect free market blueprint works in country A but completely collapses or, creates social disaster in country B, Knies provides the framework for the answer.
And the answer is because the economists who wrote the blueprints were ignoring everything that makes country B unique. Its history, its physical geography, and what Knies called its national character.
So before we get into the arguments themselves, which are fascinating, let's talk a bit about the man himself. Who was Karl Knies?
Well, he was a key figure in what's known as the German Historical School of Economics, which was an intellectual movement that fundamentally opposed those abstract, deductive methods of the classical school. He actually dedicated this work to his colleague, Wilhelm Röscher, expressing great high esteem for his merits. But, and this is the interesting part, this dedication was almost like a subtle intellectual battlefield.
How so?
Because he was simultaneously preparing to fiercely oppose several of Röscher's core beliefs, especially his ideas about the stages of economic development.
That's fascinating. That internal tension of admiring the pathbreaker while wanting to, refine the path. And the sources suggest his personal life was anything but stable when he wrote this.
Oh, not at all. He wrote that this work was completed amidst what he called bitterest experiences and in the most unsettling external situation. He notes in the preface that he started the manuscript as a university professor in Marburg, but he finished the foreword as a Gymnasiallehrer, a high school teacher in Schaffhausen, which was a foreign country for him.
Wow. So a forced career change and a move to another country. That kind of personal upheaval must have fed directly into his belief that circumstances dictate everything.
Undeniably. It reinforced his central philosophical stance, that life, institutions, and therefore economics are defined by specific, concrete, historical, and external conditions, not by some abstract, timeless certainties.
And that personal journey really sharpens the core argument of the book. The central conflict here is his complete rejection of what he calls the absolutism of the classical economists.
Right. They sought these universal physics-like laws for all human commerce. But Knies said economic truth, like all human truth, is fundamentally relative. It's a product of specific national, historical, and geographic circumstances.
So let's dig into that, this principle of relativity.
The term relativity is crucial for him. His core axiom is that economic conditions and the theories about them are an Ergebnis der geschichtlichen Entwicklung, a direct result of historical development. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything is in a living connection with its historical period, the specific country, the political institutions, which means there are no universal constants in human economic activity.
And this leads him straight to his attack on the whole classical project, the search for Naturgesetz, their Volkswirtschaft, natural, unchanging laws of political economy. He argues these so-called natural laws are built on two completely flawed pillars.
The first pillar is the assumption that human economic behavior is constantly and solely driven by an unwandelbaren, an unchanging instinct of private egoism, rigid self-interest. They saw that as the fixed, predictable engine for everything.
And the second?
The second, which is related, is the idea that the only goal of the state is to achieve the maximum possible material well-being, completely disregarding any political or moral goods. Knies argues that if you build your science on those two axioms, the entire classical edifice is just intellectually and ethically unstable.
Okay, we have to spend some time on that egoism principle, because that really is the ideological engine of classical thought, right?
Yeah.
Why did Knies see it as such a fundamental error?
He hits it with a deep ethical challenge right away. Morally, Knies argues that if you assert self-centered egoism as your foundation, you're making political economy the only social science built on an inherently immoral foundation.
That's a powerful accusation. It means economics starts by accepting the worst of human nature,
Which then automatically puts the entire field in conflict with the state's highest task.
which is to promote cohesion, justice.
Exactly. The common good, the Gemeinwohl. If political economy, the science guiding the state's material life, is built on individual selfishness, then the two spheres are doomed to contradict each other. And he's really careful with his language here. He makes a key distinction between the pursuit of one's own well-being, Eigenwohl, and pure selfishness, or Eigennutz.
Can you break that down? Because one sounds productive and the other sounds destructive.
It's a vital distinction. Eigenwohl is rational self-interest. You have to feed yourself, shelter your family. This isn't contradictory to the common good. A functioning society depends on it. But Eigennutz is selfishness. It's an obsessive focus on yourself that sees others with indifference or even hostility and seeks gain at the expense of the collective. Methode says real economic life is a complex mix of motives: self-love, altruism, common sense, not just this rigid, destructive Eigennutz that classical theory needed for its models to work.
So classical economics basically built its universal rules by looking at the actions of the most narrowly self-serving people, the pure merchants, and then just mistakenly elevated that one behavior into a universal law for all of humanity.
Precisely. They mistook a historically specific observation for a natural constant of human behavior. And this leads Knies to his most clever logical challenge, what he calls the test of education and morality.
Which basically asks, what happens if people get better, if they stop being so selfish?
Exactly. Knies argues that if rigid self-interest were the fixed foundation of economic laws, then improvements in education, morality, and social cohesion, which demonstrably reduce Eigennutz, would logically shatter the very basis of the theory. The fact that societies strive to become less selfish proves that the human factor is variable. It means classical economics relies on the perpetual moral immaturity of humanity for its laws to stay true.
That is a massive aha moment. It reframes their whole project. The science they were proposing was fundamentally anti-progress because human progress would undermine its own laws.
Right. And this critique forces Knies to be really precise about what went wrong with earlier critics of this absolutism. He says the failure of universal theory happens across two different dimensions: space and time.
The two types of theoretical short-sightedness.
First, there's cosmopolitanism. This is the error of ignoring geography, of ignoring space. Classical theories cooked up in, say, industrial England were assumed to apply everywhere, ignoring vastly different physical and cultural terrains.
And he notes that others, like Adam Miller, had already pointed this out.
Yes, Miller had attacked Smith for this. But then there's the second dimension, time, or what Knies calls perpetualism.
And that's the error of ignoring historical development, assuming what's true today was true in ancient Rome and will be true in the future.
Exactly. And Friedrich List, a precursor in the historical school, had attacked Smith for this, arguing that nations pass through different stages and need different policies, like protectionism.
But Knies saw List's approach as still flawed, didn't he?
He did, because List, even though he recognized historical stages, still tried to create a universal sequence of development. Hunting, pastoral, agricultural, industrial. He assumed every nation had to follow that exact same linear path. Knies's view is much more robust because he attacks absolutism on both fronts at once. He sees relativity across space and time, geography, climate, national character. It all means that not all nations can, or even should, follow the same path.
So for Knies, a theory isn't just wrong because it was developed in the wrong country or in the wrong century. It's wrong because it ignores the unique combination of both that makes every nation's situation totally singular. Okay, let's unpack this shift in focus. We've established that human nature is variable. Now, Knies argues that even before we look at policies or morals, the very ground beneath our feet dictates our economic life.
He's crystal clear on this. The natural endowment of a nation determines the inherent substrate for its economic activity. He starts with geology and mineral wealth and the colossal differences they create.
And he uses the stats from his own era to just hammer this point home.
Absolutely. Take coal. In the mid-19th century, Great Britain was producing an astonishing 71% of Europe's total coal. Compare that to Germany at 9%. This massive disparity wasn't just about fuel for factories.
It had these second-order effects, right?
Huge ones. If you have abundant coal, you don't need to use your forests for firewood or charcoal. You can clear that forest land and turn it into high-value agriculture.
That's a staggering advantage. The coal fuels the factories, and it frees up the land to grow food, which supports a bigger, denser industrial workforce. It's a completely unearned, non-political advantage that makes any comparison between Britain and, say, a Balkan state almost meaningless without accounting for geology first.
And it extends to other resources. He cites salt production, a massive industrial requirement back then. England produced nearly a quarter of Europe's total. He also points to how large-scale historical shifts, like the opening of gold and silver mines in the Americas, fundamentally altered global economic positions, often overriding decades of human policy. Nature deals the first hand, and economics has to play it.
This moves us beyond just raw materials to the role of climate. And Knies stresses that climate impacts so much more than just whether your crops grow.
It profoundly shapes human capital. Knies talks about how heat, moderate warmth, or extreme cold directly impact what he calls Arbeitslust and Arbeitsfähigkeit labor eagerness and labor capacity.
Right. In a region with extreme heat, the sheer physical effort of staying cool reduces the hours and intensity of manual labor you can do, no matter how motivated you are.
Precisely. And in extreme cold, just surviving consumes vast amounts of energy and resources. This leads to his second point on climate, consumption. Climate sets necessary needs, things like clothing, housing, and fuel, bekleiding, Wohnungen, Feuerungsmaterial.
This is a devastating critique of any universal theory of wages or prices. If your theory is based on the needs of some abstract average human, it fails immediately. The calories and resources needed to survive in a warm climate are radically different from those in a harsh northern one.
Exactly. A wage that lets you thrive in one place means poverty and death in another, regardless of productivity. An abstract living wage is simply untenable for Knies.
The third fundamental natural condition he highlights is water.
Water is essential, not just for farming, but for communication and power. He points to navigable rivers which determine internal trade routes. But also, crucially, they provided the treibende und bewegende Kraft, the driving and moving force for early modern industry. Before steam power was everywhere, your industrial location was basically predetermined by where the rivers flowed.
And of course, there's the ultimate water advantage, having a coastline.
Proximity to the sea is critical. It facilitates trade, fishing, it supports a denser population. Knies sees coastal countries as inherently more resilient and better positioned for an independent trade policy.
This all leads to his most encompassing territorial factor, where a nation is located relative to global trade networks.
Right. A nation's economy is never a closed system. It's linked to its neighbors and to the major global powers. Its position relative to the global hubs and nodes determines its advantages. Engaging in long-distance trade concentrates capital, but it also introduces huge systemic risks from things happening on the other side of the world wars, market shifts, policy changes, all things totally beyond that nation's control.
So any universal law of production or exchange is just useless if your nation is landlocked, resource poor, or stuck on the periphery of global power. The very ground dictates the rules of the game.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Knies has established that economic potential is relative to the land, geology, and climate, the forces of necessity. Now, he pivots to the forces of freedom and culture, stressing that the human factor, national character, and historical institutions is equally non-universal.
This requires moving beyond the classical economist abstract homo economicus and looking at real people shaped by real history. Knies argues that differences in race and national character profoundly affect economic outcomes.
He breaks this down into 3 layers of difference. First, physical differences, variations in physical strength and endurance. Knies, writing in the 19th century, cites contemporary observations of differences between groups, African Negroes, American Indians, and Caucasians, and their inherent capacities, noting these influence raw labor productivity.
Then there are the differences in thinking and inclination.
Second, mental and spiritual differences, variations in intellectual aptitude, temperament, and even manual dexterity. He argues that different nations display specific, historically developed aptitudes for certain trades. Some might be inclined toward commerce, others toward craftsmanship. Acknowledging this means the most rational economic policy for one nation might be completely irrational for another.
And third, and this might be the most powerful critique of all, is the position that economics holds in a nation's spiritual life.
Exactly. Knies observes that in some cultures, material wealth and accumulation are primary goals. In others, they're secondary, maybe subordinated to military strength or religious piety. A theory that assumes wealth maximization is the only goal is guaranteed to fail in a society where the highest good is something else entirely.
This brings us directly to the influence of historical institutions, specifically the church, which often acted in ways that completely contradict the universal egoism model.
The church's historical influence directly interrupted and shaped the pursuit of profit. Let's look at land accumulation. After Constantine, the church gained the right to accept donations. This led to it accumulating vast amounts of land in some places, over a third of the entire country.
That's staggering. A single legal and religious decision creates a land ownership structure that defines the economy for 1,000 years, completely outside of market competition.
Precisely. Then you have the concept of the just price, the justum pretium. The church established a moral framework that frowned on commercial profit that came from, say, exploiting a buyer's ignorance.
That's an explicit institutional rejection of the whole maximizing principle.
It's a radical moral counterpoint. Knies cites early Christian thinkers like Augustine, who criticized the worldly principle of vile amir et caro vendor, buying cheap and selling dear. Instead, they advocated for giving the seller the just price, even if they didn't know the true value of their goods. That is a direct theological intervention against using asymmetric information for profit.
And what about the famous usury prohibition, the ban on taking interest? Classical economists often just dismiss this as historical ignorance.
Knies completely refutes that. He notes that commercial interest, usura, was already permitted under Roman law for productive loans. The church's ban came from a specific moral context. In the Middle Ages, loans were usually sought for consumption by the poor out of dire necessity, like famine.
So it wasn't an economic decision, but a moral theological one.
Correct. It was designed to protect the vulnerable. Charging interest in that context was seen as exploiting human distress. This proves that economic structures are fundamentally moral and political products, not just the automatic results of some universal law of capital.
This really illustrates how systems of property rights aren't constants either. They're historical constructs.
Absolutely. You can see it by comparing ancient and modern property systems. In the ancient Greek model, like in Sparta, property, especially land, belonged primarily to the state, the polis. The individual just managed their plot. The individual existed for the state.
A total inversion of modern liberal thought.
Right. And even the ancient Roman model, while it recognized private property more explicitly, still heavily restricted it for public welfare, reflecting their constant need to organize for war.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
But that Roman focus contrasts starkly with the medieval and modern shift. Influenced by Christian and Germanic ideas, the focus gradually moved towards the state, existing to secure the individual's freedom and property. The very foundation of who owns what shifts radically across history.
That dive into property is crucial. And speaking of radical shifts, Knies even shows how the ultimate rejection of property communism is itself historically relative.
This is a powerful point. He sees three historically distinct forms of communal thought.
First, the political communism of antiquity.
Typified by Plato's Republic. The goal was purely political. Increasing state power, strengthening unity. It was about order and stability, not economic equality.
Second, religious communism.
Which you see in medieval monastic orders. This was driven by ascetic detachment from earthly goods. The goal was spiritual salvation, not material redistribution.
And finally, the modern form, born from the industrial age.
Economic communism, from thinkers like Proudhon and the socialists. This form is focused purely on maximizing production and achieving equality through a different economic organization. Knies points out that the arguments for economic communism would be utterly absurd if you applied them to the motives of religious ascetics, who actively sought poverty.
So even the ultimate rejection of the economic order is just a reflection of the obsession of the age in which it arises.
We've established the relativity of geography and human culture. Now Knies pulls these threads together by showing how the major economic systems that claimed universal truth were, in fact, just self-interested expressions of their specific historical conditions.
Let's start with the mercantilists from the 16th to 18th century.
Mercantilism was the theory of ruthless national self-interest. It emerged during a period of sharp national isolation and constant warfare. Economic competition was basically the same as military competition. Their focus on industry and movable wealth, like gold, was perfectly rational for their time. It was a theory for national survival in a hostile world.
Then came the French physiocrats in the 18th century.
They were a reaction against all that state regulation. Their ideas of laissez-faire, laissez-passer were rooted in the Enlightenment and the coming French Revolution. But, as me notes, they made their own error. They just substituted one bias for another, elevating agriculture as the only source of wealth, which mostly benefited the landowning nobility.
Which leads us to the giant of the classical school, Adam Smith.
Smith's Wealth of Nations was the perfect theoretical expression of the rising Third Estate and the Industrial Revolution in Britain. His ideas division of labor, focus on labor-derived wealth, aligned perfectly with the times. But crucially, his theory was based on the specific conditions of Great Britain at that moment. A nation with huge colonial resources, massive coal wealth, and total naval dominance. His laws were the optimal policy for a nation that was already winning.
So if Smith provided the theory for the victor, then List provided the theory for the challenger.
Exactly. Knies looks at Friedrich List, the theorist of the German customs union, the Zollverein. List's system of protectionism and national industrial development was a direct response to the competitive disadvantage German states faced against industrialized Britain. It was a political necessity born from a struggle for survival.
It's a devastating conclusion, then. No economic system is universally correct. They're all just the intellectual expression of the self-interest of a dominant class or a nation at a specific moment, disguised as eternal truth.
Knies says they are all painted with the soil, the Erdische Beigeschmack of their origin. He shows that abstract free trade positions appeal to the capital-strong entrepreneur who doesn't fear foreign competition. Protectionism appeals to laborers and local industrialists who need defense. Economic systems are political tools.
And this critique extends to the very idea of progress. Knies then dismantles these linear development models, like List's idea that all nations go from hunting to industry in the same order.
He calls these stage theories an absurd extension of absolutism. They ignore two realities. First, initial conditions vary. Nations don't all start from the same place. Civilized nations, he says, often had agriculture and crafts from the very beginning.
And second, and this is more powerful, he argues that nature prevents uniformity.
Yes, the varying natural basis, the territory, the climate, physically prevents all nations from following the same path to the same destination. A trade-focused economy might be rational for a coastal nation, but suicidal for a resource-rich, landlocked one.
So if you can't find these universal nature gazettes, these natural laws, what method does Knies actually propose?
He advocates for the true historical method. You don't derive sweeping laws from isolated facts. He calls those ripped-out eyes that cannot see because they have no context. Instead, you find Entwicklungsgesetz development laws through analogy.
And what does that mean in practice?
It means deep comparative historical study. You have to study economic phenomena like interest laws or property rights in their full context. Political, moral, cultural, geographic.
Yep.
You compare how 5 different states handled land distribution during wartime or how 3 different religions viewed wealth.
So by comparing across time and space, you start to see patterns, not unchanging constants, but patterns of how things tend to evolve.
And critically, the outcome is not a fixed, timeless law. It leads to the recognition that laws are constantly evolving. These development laws have to be continually adjusted by new historical experiences. The human spirit can't foresee future technologies or moral revolutions, so economic theory must always be a work in progress.
It requires a humbler, but maybe more powerful form of economic science.
Knies' final synthesis rests on accepting the interplay of necessity and freedom. Necessity is what's imposed by nature and history. Freedom is human will, moral choice. And for him, economic analysis must always yield to higher political and moral goods.
So it reframes the whole purpose of economics. It's not a science of pure maximization. It's a tool that has to serve the ethical stability of the nation.
Absolutely. The most successful political economy is one that acknowledges its findings must support the ethical and political mission of the human race. Prosperity isn't the final goal. It's just a condition for fulfilling a higher duty. The moment economic goals conflict with the higher duties of the state-like national self-preservation or social cohesion, the economic goal has to yield.
This historical view also lets him cut through polarized debates, like free trade versus protectionism.
It does. He sees both as expressions of the well-understood egoism of specific classes. Free trade appeals to merchants who gain from wide circulation. Protectionism appeals to local industrialists and laborers who need defense.
So neither is an absolute good. They're just relative to the national situation and which class holds the most political power.
And this relativity infects the most basic vocabulary of economics. Concepts like good, value, or productivity aren't fixed constants. They're relative terms dependent on local historical assumptions. The definition of productive labor changed radically across the mercantilist, physiocratic, and classical schools.
So if the building blocks themselves are subjective and relative, then finding absolute laws of price and wages that hold true for all time is, well, it's logically impossible.
And that is why his method of analogy is so important. He insists that gathering as many historical facts as possible from every context is the only way to see the pattern of change, the Entwicklungsgesetz. It requires the painful recognition that constancy is an illusion, and the science must be constantly revised by the messy, unpredictable flow of human history.
This deep dive into Karl Knies' 1853 work is a powerful antidote to any economist who tries to tell you that one policy fits all. Let's quickly summarize the key takeaways that define the enduring value of the historical method.
Takeaway number 1, relativity is king. Economic laws are not absolute. They are products of their specific national, territorial, and historical context. Geography, climate, politics, they are indispensable factors.
2. Egoism is insufficient. Self-interest, especially in its rigid, selfish form, Eigennutz, cannot be the sole foundation of economic theory. It conflicts with human morality and the higher mission of the state.
And 3, the historical method. Understanding economic life requires deep comparative historical analysis, what he calls analogy, to find nonlinear development laws, recognizing that national character and physical geography are determinative constraints. Knies suggests that every great economic system, from mercantilism to Smith's liberalism, is only the intellectual expression of a specific class or national interest at a specific time, just disguised as eternal truth. He forces us to step back and ask, which specific local interests are defining the universal laws of our own age, and what essential historical, cultural, or geographic factors are they conveniently choosing to ignore in the name of simplicity? The history of economic thought proves that the assumptions you make about the land and the people are the real basis of your theory.